Night waters of the southwest Pacific, enemy waters, sea roads for the passage of Japanese armaments going south to smash U.S. troops fighting for island beaches. Domain of the escort destroyer, guarding convoys of anti-aircraft, machine guns, concrete for pillboxes. Then, one night, suddenly, mysteriously, 2 ships were wiped out of a convoy. 1 ship left burning. 1 sunk. This was only the beginning. In 1 month, 41,000 tons of Japanese cargo vessels were sunk, 43,000 damaged. Next month, 13 ships attacked, 6 damaged, 7 sunk. News of the losses leak out. Radio Tokyo invents alibis. New American superplanes reported in the Pacific, surpassing anything known in speed and maneuverability. Reverberations in the Japanese High Command. New detachments of night fighters called up. Japanese fleet adjustments made. More destroyers, cruisers for convoy escort. The attacker was an unidentified American plane hitting at night. They bombed the destroyers, light cruisers, heavy cruisers. What is this superplane? Anything familiar? That torso with a middle-aged sag? Her speed less than some cars can do. Maneuverable? Some days all right. On others, she brings around like a 10-ton truck. She dives under protest. Wings can't handle half the pressure dive bombers take. Got her? Right. The old Cat, Navy Catalina patrol boat, PBY in a black nightgown for night camouflage. A black cat. She hides by day in one of the secret U.S. Navy cat bases, which the enemy would love to know about. It's 8 a.m. Base personnel watching for a black cat overdue. Last heard from at midnight, attacking a Japanese merchant ship. But they don't watch long. Here comes the cat, and it's a zoom, a signal that she did it again. One more enemy ship on the bottom. Plowing around for the lee shore now and quiet waters. A wait for the tow line. Up the ramp, tail first. The squadron commander, wanting to know any wounded? After 14 hours of flight. Commodore Combs, commander of the task force, arrives in his jeep with Captain Peck in charge of the group. Large freighter made 2 bombing runs. Exploded ammunition cargo. Now off to get details and new plans for the coming night's mission. And that beer, which all hands look forward to. But there's 1 bottle left over. A Navy cameraman hit on the first run, so no pictures. But tonight's another night with a mate to take his place. As soon as the cat's home, she's groomed for the next prowl. That's a blitz buggy towing her into position for overhaul. Some job for a maintenance officer keeping an aerial antique, acting like a dive bomber. The bad symptoms sheet. Port propeller throwing oil. Nothing serious, but a new part is needed. These cats take plenty. Some here are nearly 4 years old. Now, 8 bullet holes, starboard wing. 6, 7, 8. Not so bad. Black cats have wheezed home with more than 100 holes showing through their sides. It came out here, the shrapnel that nicked our cameraman. Such holes are penciled first, clipped, a plate board, riveted. A leak in the fuel tank plug. Gas goes in. Don't ration it. We'll be up all night and part of the next day. Last night's strain told on the tail assembly. Repaired now, wagon her tail and raring to go. But first she needs her claws sharpened. The Black Cat's bomb dump. Quarter tonners. And this, the size Japanese cruisers have a weakness for. 50 calibers, defense against Japanese fighters tonight. The tail fin screwed on tight. When you swan dive through anti-aircraft, you want bombs that lay in right. Back to the cat. Patrol boats weren't made for bombing. She wears them under her wing because there's no other place. For every pound of bombs dropped last month, 1 ton of enemy shipping was sunk or damaged. Records like that mean plenty in any language, dollars or yen. Now a tin fish for the port wing. And the 50 caliber just in case, but we'd rather not have to use it. Darkness is the cat's best defense. Darkness and her black nightgown. But the guns are checked. And the cat stands ready, feeling her years, but as fit for combat as good wishes can make her. But first, looking for a stowaway aft. Yes, 2 kinds of black cats at this base. Overside you. In the meantime, the crew we're flying with in an hour is off for a spot of water polo. Coconuts to you. Now a quick look in on the officers' quarters. Our cat's masters. That's the squadron commander at the mirror. Big game hunters at night, but the housekeeping has to be done. Evening clothes, 45s, jungle knives, just in case luck runs out and you have to walk home. And the picture. Off for briefing. Final instructions. Final warnings. Six black cats will fly tonight. They're pilots and navigators. First discussion. New angles of enemy strategy. To draw more blood from U.S. invading troops, Japan is feeding key defenses with ammunition, guns, concrete for pillboxes. Our objective, to stop them at sea, where 1 bomb can sink what 100 bombing runs ashore might not destroy. Latest enemy convoy sighting, southbound, 1 tanker, 3 freighters, probably artillery and ammunition, estimated position at 0200. Watch out for Japanese night fighters, nearest airstrip only 60 miles away. Any destroyer escorts? 2 cans like this, 5-inch guns, Elevation for anti-aircraft barrage, 2 aft, 1 forward. 2 ack topside, and you may have a light cruiser on your hands, one sighted yesterday in that area. The search plan for locating the convoy. Area A for the command plane. Area B. Whoever spots the convoy first will signal other planes immediately, including the 2 standby planes. Command plane will direct attack. On the way north, the command plane will search enemy-held Harbor X, where the convoy may have dropped anchor temporarily. Watch out for land ack. There's plenty. A nest of 6 heavies to the north. 2 heavies here, 4 mediums south. Last topic, weather. On some nights, even more of a headache than ack. Storm fronts building up to the north, 30-knot headwinds to fight on the way home. Turn back early. If the night clears, don't make a target out of yourself by getting in front of the moon. Now, a half hour left for some quick chow. Command plane overside in 5 minutes. Sandwich makings from home. California sardines, Chicago ham spread, orange juice from Florida to wash it down. A squall bearing down from the sea, but the cats leave per schedule. In all the space's history, foul weather has never stopped a flight. She slides in, hull settling deep under bomb-laden wings. Landing gear disengaged, wallowing out for the takeoff. Peeling away into the run, motors growling over the job of lifting too many men off the water. Too much gas, but she's up on the step. Bear off. Another night, another mission, another prowl into the dark. A cat needs its 9 lives on these jobs. Night, and the weather kicks up. Rough enough to be airsick if you had time. But getting nearer Harbor X, where the convoy might be hiding out, whether or no weather, the cat gives up altitude to find out. Navigator to captain, Harbor X reckoned 10 miles ahead. Repeat to waist gunners. Harbor X, 3 miles off port bow. A lookout posted in the Black Cat's nose. Our last check of the land ack positions ahead. The moon breaks through, silhouetting the cat. Enemy fighter planes coming up, Captain. Harbor X dead ahead. No convoy down there. Lower for a second look. Harbor X empty. Convoy still out at sea. Now to get out, quick. But we're spotted. We took one. Another. Night fighters hard off port beam. Stand by for a dive to hide. The cat flattens out. Here's where a black nightgown counts. The Japanese need better glasses. Now a cautious bank to sea to resume convoy search. Convoy's original O-200 position was 50 miles, bearing 5 degrees. Convoy off port bow. Tail end of the convoy, ammunition freighter. Position signaled to 5 other black cats, 0420 south, 15012 east. The plane veers into the wake of the cruiser. Other cats arrive. Pick our angle on the cruiser. Then pounce. Press the pickle and lay an egg. A hit. Miss. Another run. A hit. Lane 3 goes in. Now the cats get out, with 1 freighter sunk, 1 damaged, 1 tanker burning, a cruiser hit. The cost, Black Cat number 5, whose 9th life went up in the smoke of the freighter she sank. One more flight completed. 1 less convoy flying the rising sun. Another loss in losses adding up to billions of dollars in equipment that didn't get there. A job done by planes that can't maneuver but do, that can't dive, that can't rev up speed to wiggle out of a run but go in anyway for a second try, a third. What keeps them going? This, among other things, these are American troops grabbing at a beach guarded by pillboxes and machine guns, by Japanese cannon, mortars, grenades. These things don't grow there. They come in ships that can be sunk, and every less ship gives the men who are landing a better break. That's what keeps the cats flying.
It may not have been the quickest or the most visually appealing aircraft in World War II. It wasn't the easiest plane to handle, yet the PBY Catalina flying boat became one of the most dependable and respected aircraft ever made.
It was a good airplane. Low altitude, rough weather. She was a tough little beast.
In service, this straightforward, sturdy, and adaptable aircraft proved to be the perfect workhorse across the globe. Capable of operating on both land and water, the Catalina transported supplies, performed long-range patrols, and rescued countless stranded sailors and airmen.
That airplane did everything it was asked to do, and more.
However, it also possessed a darker, more threatening side. In the Atlantic, Catalinas bombed and sank numerous German submarines. In the Pacific, black-painted Catalinas swooped on Japanese ships under cover of night. In 1907, a young motorcycle builder from Hammondsport, New York, developed a fascination with the thrill of flight. His name was Glenn H. Curtiss, and he would be forever remembered as the creator of a unique type of aircraft. Curtiss was a natural-born inventor. After various experiments, he developed an aircraft capable of taking off and landing on water, the flying boat. It wasn't long before the military took notice. In World War I, flying boats were heavily used as reconnaissance planes, primarily for submarine spotting. This marked the start of a new era in naval warfare.
In the First World War, the U.S. Navy really didn't have a land plane capability, so the backbone of U.S. Navy operations was the flying boat. And during World War I, they developed the NC flying boat, which was designed to be a long-range aircraft capable of flying great distances across the Atlantic, which, in fact, one of them did in May of 1919.
After the war, hundreds of surplus planes were sold at low prices, sparking the aviation passion that had gripped America. The flying boat's ability to operate on any calm water surface granted it nearly limitless range, expanding new horizons for aviation. When Pan American launched its luxurious clipper flights to Central and South America, the golden age of the flying boat had dawned. Much like Grand Ocean liners, Pan Am clippers of the 1930s allowed the wealthy to travel in elegance to far-off places. The Navy also envisioned a strategic role for long-range aircraft to patrol the world's oceans, providing early warnings of any threats to American interests. Soon, the flying boat became an essential element of national defense planning.
The main advantages of the flying boat over wheeled aircraft, certainly in the early stages before the advent of the aircraft carrier, was the great range that they had. Plus, they could land almost anywhere, so they could set down in any number of forward bases. And so that's what made the flying boat a real advantageous platform for Navy operations, particularly in the Pacific, where the Navy was definitely looking towards fighting the next war.
In 1933, the Navy invited proposals for a new long-range patrol aircraft. The Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, already experienced in designing flying boats for the Navy, was eager to win this critical contract. Their lead designer was a skilled engineer named Isaac Macklin Lattin, known to everyone as Mac. In the early 1930s, most planes were still biplanes, with fabric-covered wings held up by a web of steel wires. In a bold approach, Mac Lattin designed a metal monoplane. Its vast wing was mounted on a single pylon above the fuselage, anchored to the hull with only 4 struts, 2 on each side. All flying boats required outrigger floats for stability on water, but these floats became a drawback in the air, creating drag and reducing overall performance. Mac Lattin devised a clever solution, designing floats that folded up during flight to become the wingtips, minimizing drag while adding lift. The Navy was duly impressed, and in June 1935, Consolidated secured a contract for 60 aircraft, the largest military order since World War I. The aircraft that rolled off the production line would become iconic, identified by the code letters PBY, P for patrol, B for bomber, and Y, the prefix for consolidated. The PBY was a sizable plane with a striking appearance.
Here were all those great big beautiful PBYs. It was love at first sight. And I said, well, I've got to fly those.
Along came a PBY, and it was gracefully soaring above us. And it was so beautiful. In my mind, it was like a soaring eagle. It just soared and made slow turns. And later on, I found out what a devil it could be in combat.
PBY, the Navy called her.
Back in 1935, the first PBYs took to the water and the air. Commonplace today, but then a milestone in the history of aviation.
It became best known as the Catalina, or simply the Cat. With a cruising speed of just over 130 miles per hour, the twin-engine Catalina wasn't especially fast, but it offered remarkable endurance with a range exceeding 3,000 miles and the ability to stay airborne for more than 15 hours. Though it was always susceptible to attack, the PBY's main armament was formidable. It included 2 heavy machine guns mounted in blisters on each side of the rear fuselage. Although initially designed for patrol missions, the PBY could carry 4 1,000-pound bombs or 2 torpedoes, significantly boosting its tactical value for the Navy.
The PBY did everything it was asked to do and more. It covered a lot of ground and it could remain aloft for a great deal of time. Basically, though, it was designed to spot the enemy fleet. Radar was just in its infancy then, and nothing could beat a pair of 2 human eyes in spotting the fleet and reporting it back to home base.
By the late 1930s, the world was becoming increasingly dangerous. In the Pacific, Japan was growing more powerful and aggressive, while in Europe, Hitler's Germany was rearming openly, building a navy to control the Atlantic. Britain and America watched with caution as tensions continued to rise. Both countries recognized that airborne early warning would be crucial in future conflicts. Most admirals still placed their confidence in large gun-armed warships, but a few suspected that air power would decide any upcoming war. They would soon see how accurate this belief was. September 1939, Europe is thrust into war. Britain's first line of defense was the Royal Navy. Many of its ships were equipped with seaplanes launched by catapult to scout beyond the horizon. The challenge was retrieving them. The open sea posed serious risks for landing an aircraft. Multi-engine, long-range patrol planes offered a safer alternative, but Britain's strained RAF didn't have nearly enough of them. In 1940, they ordered a fleet of PBYs to aid in patrolling the Atlantic. It was the RAF pilots who first named the aircraft Catalina. They appreciated the aircraft and soon realized that the B in PBY truly signified bomber. They began using their Catalinas to attack German U-boats. Since the start of the war, Nazi submarine wolf packs had prowled the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, sinking numerous British vessels. The Catalina quickly became a crucial asset in the fight against U-boats, locating and destroying them in growing numbers. However, Germany's formidable surface fleet continued to pose a grave threat. In May 1941, the Cat played a role in securing a significant British naval victory. The Royal Navy was chasing the German battleship Bismarck, 42,000 tons of steel, and the pride of Hitler's battle fleet. In a clash west of Iceland, Bismarck had sunk the British battleship HMS Hood with a direct hit. Only 3 of her crew members survived. The Bismarck then disappeared into the fog.
Somewhere under that mystery of fog, the Bismarck was steaming under forced draft for a safe haven. Then a rift in the clouds, a telltale wake. A Catalina flashed the word, "Quarry sighted."
It was an RAF Catalina patrol plane from Coastal Command that finally tracked down the Bismarck. Its location was relayed, and Britain's Royal Navy moved in to finish the job. The Bismarck went down with only 115 of the 2,400 crew members surviving.
Britain had maintained her supremacy in the North Atlantic with the help of a plane designed to maintain United States supremacy in the Pacific.
The attack on the Bismarck clearly highlighted the value of long-range patrol aircraft in combat. The U.S. quickly took note.
The destruction of the Bismarck, that great and powerful ship, had to be accomplished to be true to the traditions of the British Royal Navy.
They played their part in a victory which is proudly marked up along with victories of the past, the greatest pursuit and kill in history.
The long-range Catalina was an ideal aircraft for ocean patrols, though getting it in and out of the water required cumbersome beaching gear, making the process slow and laborious. To address this issue, the PBY-5A was introduced, with A standing for amphibian. Featuring a retractable undercarriage, this version of the Cat was equally capable on land or sea. Catalinas were soon stationed at U.S. bases throughout the Pacific, from Midway to the Philippines and from Wake Island to Pearl Harbor. As Japan grew increasingly aggressive, the Navy intensified its daily reconnaissance flights. Then, on a calm Sunday morning in December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor.
So I've seen them coming around one by one. They'd strafe and bomb, and then they make a circle and come around again. They must have made 3 or 4 passes on each attack. You couldn't believe it, and you didn't think it was happening. The whole sky was black with smoke. Everything was on fire, and there was dead people on the dock, and the oil was 3 feet thick on the water, and people were going around. It was utter confusion.
The assault not only crippled the American Pacific Fleet, but nearly obliterated the airborne patrol force, with 67 Catalinas severely damaged or destroyed.
They picked a beautiful time. Everybody was saluting the flag. And they weren't saluting their guns.
Pearl Harbor served as a harsh lesson for the Americans. Despite extensive long-range patrols, U.S. forces failed to spot the approaching Japanese fleet. In the aftermath, recruitment offices across the nation were flooded with young volunteers eager to join the fight.
I was very highly agitated at what happened out at Pearl Harbor. We weren't told too much about what happened other than it was a big blow to the fleet. And I joined the Navy the next day thinking that I got to go. December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. My father was going to be the big stopper in my mind. When I came home that afternoon, and he said, "How was school?" I gave him the papers that I needed to get his signature on. And he thought for a long time. And he said, "Well, I'm too old to go, and we're going to be at war." And he said, "You go." And he signed, with tears in his eyes.
Smoke from the burning wreckage at Pearl Harbor lingered for days. But with America now at war, Catalina crews, still reeling from the devastating loss, would soon be at the forefront.
The feel at that time was, we've got to do something, and we've got to do it fast.
Early in 1942, new Catalinas began rolling off the production lines to replace those lost at Pearl Harbor. As new orders flooded into the consolidated factory, the demand for more workers grew in the race to accelerate production.
I'd put on my application that I'd worked with some radios, and of course the interviewer had a drawer that he opened up, and he said, "What's that?" I said, "It's a soldering iron." "What's that?" "That's a wire cutter." "You're an electrician." So I became an electrician, and that was when the company was building from very few people, just hiring all the time. And they're consolidated. We were working 11 hours a day and 7 days a week.
The Cat quickly earned the respect and admiration of its crews. A standard PBY crew was composed of 8 members, a bombardier who also served as the bow gunner, a pilot and co-pilot, a navigator, a radio operator, a flight engineer, and 2 waist gunners. Bulkheads divided the plane into 7 watertight compartments. For long patrol flights, the central section was fitted with bunks and a galley to increase crew comfort. Mastering the specialized skill of flying a seaplane required extensive training.
Well, if you ever saw what I call a PBY driver, he had thick wrists and big muscles.
The controls were as big as barn doors. It took a little bit of muscle to move them. It was unstable. She'd fall off on one wing, or the horse would wander unless you had to fly it every minute of the time. It had the smallest stabilizing tabs, which you had to constantly readjust. Every time somebody moved or the load shifted just a little bit, you had to readjust it. You couldn't relax very long in that airplane, not if you were flying it.
And the real trick on a seaplane landing at any time is to make sure you keep your wings level. You do not want to get afloat into the water at high speed, because it'll turn you around so fast it'll be a wreck.
When it come into land, why, it's a high angle, and then boom, down you come, and it really hits hard, you know, because you haven't got no control all of a sudden. Why, you put it into just about a stall just when you about to get to the water, because splat, you come down pretty hard.
It landed with a great big splash. Not a touchdown, it was a beautiful landing. But if you didn't keep coming back all the time till you got that big fat duck plowing through the water, then she'd go off the water, because there weren't any flaps, anything to kill the speed. That's the one thing about that thing that I considered pretty vicious.
While the PBY had its drawbacks, it also had considerable strengths. As crews learned to operate it, they developed a deep respect for this durable workhorse.
It's a good airplane, very good. Low altitude, rough weather, rain squalls, and she was a tough little beast.
Like a giant seabird, the Catalina glided above the ocean on its lengthy solitary patrols. Its crew would spend hours out of sight of land, scanning the water for the faint sign of a submarine periscope or a downed pilot adrift in a life raft. Keeping the engines running for hours on end was the responsibility of the flight engineer. From his cramped compartment within the wing support, he communicated with the pilot through a system of indicator lights.
The only thing the pilot has regarding the engines in the cockpit are the throttles. Everything else is back there in a tower. He relies on his engineer.
It was the navigator's role to chart their course and ensure the safe return of the aircraft.
It's nice to know where you are. Every once in a while, a crew member that wasn't doing anything would come up and look over your shoulder and said, "Where are we?" Well, you put your finger, right there. But they did trust you, no doubt about it. But sometime, you're going to be lost. You won't know where you are. So what do? You turn around and go back, and you don't know where to go back to? Do you think, well, my sense tells me that land is over there and water's over here, or what do?
In poor weather conditions, this could become an almost impossible challenge. Many lone Catalinas disappeared without a trace in the vast Pacific Ocean. The radio operator served as the only connection to the outside world. His Morse code signals would send critical early warnings of enemy activity back to the base. Soon, the Catalina crews would play a pivotal role in the legendary sea battle that would alter the entire trajectory of the war in the Pacific: Midway.
Midway Island. Not much land, right enough, but it's our outpost. A Navy patrol plane. Routine patrol. Only behind every cloud may be an enemy.
Following the calamity at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese continued to push back American forces across the Pacific. In June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy dispatched a massive task force to seize American-held Midway Island, located 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. The primary goal was to lure the remaining ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a confrontation and destroy them. However, the Japanese codes had been deciphered, and the defenders were aware that an attack was imminent. What they didn't know was the precise location of the task force.
Up until the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy, quite frankly, was not having a good war. They had only been able to score some hit-and-run raids against Japanese islands. So the Battle of Midway was very much a showdown in which the U.S. Navy was going to put it all on the line to stop the Japanese fleet.
On the morning of June 3rd, a Catalina patrol aircraft located the leading vessels of the Japanese task force. At dawn the next day, another Catalina finally identified the remaining ships, including the aircraft carriers. A large contingent of American carrier planes took off to engage the Japanese battle fleet. However, the waves of dive bombers faced superior Japanese fighters and suffered devastating losses. Then, in just 10 minutes, the tide shifted dramatically. American dive bombers targeted 3 Japanese aircraft carriers while their decks were crowded with planes being rearmed and refueled. Without air cover, the massive carriers became easy targets and quickly succumbed to American assaults. Later that day, a 4th Japanese aircraft carrier was also lost. Midway represented a catastrophic defeat for the Japanese and marked a pivotal turning point in the Pacific War at sea. At last, U.S. forces achieved a decisive victory, marking the first time the Japanese were forced onto the defensive.
In the Battle of Midway, there were some elements that played a great role, and certainly that was finding where the Japanese fleet was. And code breaking played a role in that, but it still required an aircraft to spot the ships. And it was here that the PBY played a pivotal role in the battle, because it was PBYs that spotted not only the invasion force destined for Midway, but more importantly, spotted the carrier force.
The Catalina had demonstrated its capabilities beyond any doubt, but even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Navy had already commissioned its intended successor.
The battleship of the air, the Coronado, the mightiest seaborne aircraft now in service.
The Coronado, known as the battleship of the air, was the most formidable seaborne aircraft ever constructed. This 4-engine Coronado was significantly larger and more advanced, yet it cost 3 times as much to produce as the Catalina and was a very intricate machine. In contrast, the Cat was straightforward to manufacture in large quantities, allowing it to remain the Navy's primary workhorse. Much like Henry Ford's Model T, it was slow but reliable and got the job done. However, every crewman flying a Catalina understood that, despite its armament, the sluggish Cat had little chance of surviving an encounter with Japanese fighters. Those long and solitary ocean patrols became some of the most perilous missions of the entire Pacific War.
The Catalina has been called the cruiser of the air. Her wing spread is 105 feet. Her length from nose to tail is 65 feet. She can carry a load of many tons. Her range, fully loaded, is over 4,000 miles, and the PBYs, new and old, have stood up to all the tasks imposed by modern war.
Yet, sometimes, the odds were simply insurmountable. During his first combat patrol in August 1942, Bob Dimmitt's Catalina was unexpectedly attacked by 3 Japanese fighters.
They were real show-offs. They would corkscrew in and roll I watched one of them coming in on our tail there, and he was just lazily doing rolls and shooting at us. I guess they figured that this was a big duck and it was going. Our radioman was killed. He was sitting right behind me. The mechanic was shot through the chest, and those were the two big casualties that we had. The rest of us all had small shrapnel in us.
Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the Japanese Zeros vanished. One man was killed, another was severely wounded, and the Cat sustained significant damage.
And when we got away from there, our port engine was starting to burn. But that sucker flew, and we noticed some dots on the horizon. Never saw such pretty pieces of palm trees in our life.
Somehow, they managed to crash land the injured Catalina in shallow water, skidding to a stop on the beach.
We stopped. Then we started getting kind of worried, because we really didn't know at that time where we were and whether it was friendly or enemy. So we climbed out of the airplane and stood there with our big 45s in our hands and waited.
After a week stranded on their tropical island, Bob Dimmitt and his crew began to wonder how long they could endure before assistance arrived or the Japanese came.
All of a sudden we see this dot just off the water underneath this black cloud heading right for us, and it looked like a seaplane. Well, at that time, we didn't know whether it was a Japanese seaplane or whether it was an American seaplane, so we didn't do anything. And we waited and waited and waited till the last minute, and then we could finally make out that it was a Catalina. And we were jumping up and down and yelling at him, but Santa Claus has nothing on that airplane. The relief that you feel when you have a friend that just flies by like that, there is, well, you can't describe it. We know then that we're home free.
All but one of Bob's crew made it through the ordeal, thanks to the Catalina. Such close calls had a lasting impact.
Hey, I got news for you. They were all brothers under the skin, boy, after that one there, and there was no doubt about that. We stayed close for a long time. Yeah.
Usually bonding shows up after an incident or an accident. If the pilot manages to evade and get the plane back without being shot down, he is the biggest thing in the world to that crew. So now they've bonded to the pilot, and the crew has bonded together as one. You could see it happen, and when I was on the islands in the South Pacific and the PBYs would come back from their patrol, you could tell that there's a changeover. All of a sudden, they're like brothers. You can't come between them.
Not surprisingly, every American GI in the Pacific grew fond of the Cat. Its recognizable and reassuring silhouette in the sky was always a welcome sight. For troops isolated on remote coral islands, it meant receiving mail from home. For the injured, it brought crucial medical supplies and a ride to the safety of a base hospital. For survivors adrift for days in the vast ocean, it symbolized life itself. And for the men who piloted it, the Cat became part of the family.
Oh yes. Every hop we came back on, the airplane was our baby. We loved it. We put it to bed at night, wake it up in the morning, and if we had any long flights, it never occurred to us that anything was going to go wrong.
The Cats operated in the most basic conditions, and their crews learned to be almost completely self-sufficient.
You had to be self-sufficient, and those planes were on their own. They'd be at some out-of-the-way island in a cove, and there'd be some 55-gallon drums of fuel and some oil. You lived in the plane, and you ate, cooked, and lived in the plane.
Whether on land or at sea, the big cats were most susceptible to Japanese air attacks between their missions. However, many of their forward bases were carved out of the jungle and not easily visible from above. The long-distance missions across the Pacific placed immense stress on the aircraft and the dedicated ground crews who kept them operational with only the most rudimentary tools.
Preventative maintenance is the secret to the whole thing. The old saying goes, you can't pull off the road and call for a wrecker. If you have a problem, you lose an engine, you're going to have to return to base. You have a full crew, full ammo, full gas load. Perish the thought that you lose an engine on takeoff.
The remote jungle bases lacked workshop facilities, but this did not deter the Catalina. It came equipped with its own set of folding work platforms that could be attached to the engines.
There you were on a platform. You could work in the whole accessory section.
After a specified number of flight hours, each engine required a thorough inspection.
Each check would be more intense. And you hate to see them coming because that meant that it was going to be work. Not just flying, it's going to be work. You had to get yourself dirty. And then you would have the 30, 60, 90, and 120-hour check. Now, 120 hours takes quite a long time. That's 120 hours in the air. Now the airplane's going to be down for a couple of days. In wartime, that's not really well thought of, but it has to happen. So you can imagine that there's a lot of fellas, a lot of mechanics, really running all over that airplane to get it back in the air. That's one thing a pilot doesn't want, is have his airplane on the deck. It's not what it's built for.
A strong bond formed between the pilot and the chief engineer, as lives depended on their combined expertise. Before every mission, they would meticulously inspect the aircraft together.
It's the rapport that you develop with the pilot. And if you're the chief aboard, or if you're the senior man aboard, or if you're the flight engineer, you're a little bit closer to the pilot than the rest of the crew. He'll come to you first. But he's still in charge. I realized I was the man behind the wrench. I wasn't the man up front driving. Pilot drives it. I fix it.
It's an airplane that you could fix with duct tape or something like that. If it had been too complicated, it wouldn't have been able to do the job.
Yet this reliable companion could also reveal a much more aggressive aspect of its character. When night fell, the gentle cat would turn into a formidable predator.
Guadalcanal is the most hotly contested strip of land in the South Pacific. For 5 months have tried to win back this vital outpost, but their transports, bombed and beached, lie wrecked on the sands of the Solomon Islands.
While Midway marked a turning point at sea, it was Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands that ultimately halted the Japanese ground advance. The situation was dire, as the Japanese funneled troops and supplies into battle, desperately attempting to push American forces back into the sea. The success of the entire Japanese operation hinged on regular supply runs conducted by a fleet of transport ships operating under the cover of night, protected by destroyers and light cruisers known as the Tokyo Express. The only chance for an American victory lay in severing this vital supply line. This goal was ultimately achieved with the assistance of an unexpected weapon.
Anything familiar? That torso with a middle-aged sag? Her speed less than some cars can do. Got her? Right. The old cat. Navy Catalina patrol boat, PBY in a black nightgown for night camouflage. A black cat.
It was called the Black Cat because they flew at night, and the plane was painted perfectly black.
Despite its age, the Catalina was leading the way in a new type of covert operation that would become an increasingly significant aspect of modern warfare.
During the day, to launch a PBY on any sort of attack mission would have been suicide because it was a slow and lumbering aircraft. But those attributes made it really particularly suited to night combat, where it could loiter over targets and search for them really at will.
For every pound of bombs dropped last month, 1 ton of enemy shipping was sunk or damaged. Records like that mean plenty in any language, dollars or yen.
The concept was simple, yet highly effective. Take a standard PBY Catalina patrol plane, coat it in matte black from nose to tail, conceal its glowing exhaust pipes above the wings, and switch off all navigation lights. Then attach 4,000 pounds of bombs under its wings, transforming it into a formidable weapon. This was the Black Cat, the original stealth bomber.
Another night, another mission, another prowl into the dark. A cat needs its 9 lives on these jobs.
Back at Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack by the Japanese had severely weakened the Catalina fleet. Now, shrouded in darkness, the cats sought their revenge. This time, it would be the Japanese who were caught off guard. These long-range missions were always tense and exhausting for the Catalina crews.
Skipper always had us doing things. And he'd say, you guys in the blisters, I want you to keep an eye out. And if he ever saw anything, and we didn't see it first, we was in bad trouble. we reported seeing something before he did, or he'd said, all right, what's going on back there? Do you guys sound asleep?
Without radar, the Japanese forces struggled to detect the cats in the darkness. Even powerful searchlights often failed to reveal their presence, leaving defenders to fire blindly into the night sky in hopes of hitting something.
The searchlight would be right on us, and nobody shot at us. The searchlight come right on, and everything gets all light up in the plane. Said, "Uh-oh!" We just kept right on going, and the light went off somewhere else. So they never did see us. Never would see us.
The attacks had to be executed on the first pass to maintain the element of surprise. But the slow-flying cat had ample opportunity to align itself with the target.
You know, we dropped bombs. We dropped everything we had. And I don't know, because we never did, nobody ever went down to see what had happened, because that was Japanese territory.
One more flight completed. One less convoy flying the rising sun. Another loss in losses adding up to billions of dollars in equipment that didn't get there.
In just 1 month, a single squadron reported the destruction of 43 Japanese ships as the Black Cats prowled the night skies, most of their victims unaware of what had struck them. Deprived of essential supplies, the Japanese lost their hold on the Solomon Islands and began a long and bloody retreat back to their home islands. At a pivotal moment in history, the Black Cat squadrons, engaging in nighttime hunting and bombing missions, played a crucial role in turning the tide of the war in the Pacific.
A job done by planes that can't maneuver but do, that can't dive, that can't rev up speed to wiggle out of a run but go in anyway for a second try, a third. And every less ship gives the men who are landing a better break. That's what keeps the cats flying.
When production ceased, nearly 4,000 Catalinas had been constructed, making it the most numerous flying boat ever created.
In a variety of services with a variety of nations, the PBY did everything in almost every theater of war. It dropped bombs, it dropped torpedoes, it depth-charged U-boats, it fired retro rockets. It was the Dumbo for down flyers, the salvation and savior for them when they're floating in the open ocean with little chance of rescue without the PBY. So in short, the PBY performed all missions that it was called upon to do and performed them with great ability.
After the war, while many military aircraft were scrapped, the Cats continued to serve due to their immense utility. Wherever there was water, the Catalina found a peacetime role, conducting Coast Guard patrols, firefighting, cargo transport, passenger flights, exploration, surveying, and a multitude of other tasks. Though the jet age marked the decline of most remaining flying boats, the Cats persevered. As the new millennium approached, the consolidated PBY Catalina remained in the air, one of the longest-serving and most beloved aircraft in history.
That airplane, I fell in love with it.
All I could say was, Mr. Consolidated, you did a hell of a job.
In October of 1944, with the Allies pushing east towards Berlin, Germany launches an assault in the Ardennes forest. During the Battle of the Bulge, Nazi forces attempt to push American, British, and Canadian troops off the continent of Europe. On the other side of the world, Japan launches its own counteroffensive in the Pacific. Theirs is unlike anything America has seen before. Japanese aircraft head straight towards U.S. destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, flown by men prepared to sacrifice their own lives. It is known as kamikaze, where pilots turn their planes into missiles. Suicide missions intended to cripple the American war machine as they inch closer towards the heart of Japan. These pilots follow the rule of divine wind. Loyal to the emperor and their homeland, they are willing to die for both. Their weapons are their bodies. Their targets are American ships, pilots, and sailors. This is a story from two different perspectives, from the men willing to die for their country, and from the men determined to stop them. By 1944, the Empire of Japan is in a state of retreat. The area in which they hoped to create a Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere is now a distant memory. The spirit of late 1941, when the land of the rising sun seemed invincible, has vanished. Since America's victory at Midway, the United States takes back island after island from Hirohito's forces. Japanese fighter aircraft are outnumbered by more modern American planes, being produced from the factories in droves. Experienced Japanese pilots are in short supply. In addition, the proximity fuse is utilized, making it almost impossible for Japanese bombers to get anywhere near U.S. naval vessels. No longer do they control the Pacific with an iron fist. By January of 1944, even those in the top circles of Japanese power have concluded that the war is lost. For a nation dependent on imports, they are denied the raw materials desperately needed to continue the war. Japanese merchant ships carrying oil, coal, and other goods are either attacked from the sky or torpedoed by American submarines. Production in Japan is slashed to shreds. To make matters worse, a naval blockade is causing severe shortages in food and materials, resulting in mass starvation. On paper, the war is all but won by the United States.
Really, by the fall of 1944, it's clear from Hirohito's recent biographers who've really studied the Japanese documents, by the fall of 44, he knew Japan had lost the war. But surrender was not on the table because of this notion of honor, and he was also really obsessed with protecting the sort of royal regalia, the symbols of the emperor's authority. And, you know, all through the summer of 45, the Japanese press was running what Hirohito's biographer Herbert Bix called the Die for the Emperor campaign. I mean, this was the message to the whole society.
As the American invasion forces got closer and closer to the homeland, it became an even bigger and more purposeful strategy to not necessarily to win the war, but to make the cost of getting closer and closer to the Japanese homeland so great that they'd be able to achieve a negotiated peace.
For America, the road to Tokyo has been a bloody affair, with thousands of troops killed in the process. The Japanese proved themselves to be warriors, fighting until their last breath, based on a sacred samurai code known as Bushido. Surrender is not an option for its citizens, who are told that they will be shamed forever if they give in to the Americans.
The Army and Marines had certainly encountered this in some of the islands that were taken where Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner. And they were essentially told and ordered to, oh, you don't know what's going to happen to you, and it's part of this honor not to be taken prisoners. So there had been this sort of preview of the same mentality that American forces had encountered already.
United States generals realized that if the resistance on these islands is this fierce, the invasion of Japan itself could be the mother of all bloodbaths.
The rules of war were that you fought until your last breath, and that was expected of your enemy as well. So the concept of surrendering was something that the Japanese military did not recognize or respect. And it had big consequences on both sides during the conflict, that it was no quarter on both sides.
With the acquisition of island outposts by U.S. forces, landing strips are prepared for the arrival of the massive B-29 superfortress. Being twice the size and having twice the range of the B-17, this gigantic bomber is what America hopes will be the deciding factor in the Pacific, having the capability of flying over Yokohama, Nagoya, and the capital city of Tokyo, allowing for a massive bombardment of the Japanese home islands.
Massed B-29 attacks, hundreds of bombers flying in close formation, dropping incendiaries, were extraordinarily effective in burning Japanese cities. There's no question about that. The attack in Tokyo, again, this is conventional bombs, incendiaries, burned square miles of the city, did huge amount of damage, probably caused 100,000 or so civilian deaths, rivaling or possibly even exceeding what the atomic bombs did.
If the war can be won from the air, hopefully a D-Day style invasion in the Pacific can be avoided. Yet, despite all the deaths and starvation throughout Japan, its military still refuses to acquiesce to the demands of an unconditional surrender. By mid-1944, with American forces ready to take back the Philippines, it becomes clear that the people of Japan will not accept defeat without a fight to the death. Their loyalty is to Emperor Hirohito, and the idea of foreigners occupying the homeland is a concept completely alien to them. They would rather die than surrender to America. It is this belief system that allows the kamikaze fighter to emerge.
A lot of people who've written about the kamikaze suggest that there's some origins in the Shinto religion and the samurai code, and I think that's undeniably true, but it's also stretching it. That there was this, certainly a Japanese martial tradition, there was this notion of personal loyalty to the emperor, and that was clearly driving it. Hirohito himself was very impressed and very supportive of the whole idea of these special attack forces and thought, well, this is the supreme expression of the devotion of the Japanese people to their emperor personally. That's how he viewed it.
In order to protect a perimeter of islands giving America the ability to bomb Japan, squadrons of volunteers begin enlisting for their own version of a divine wind against the United States.
A decision was made, and basically it was during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that the best chance they had of taking out the American fleet, the American invasion fleet, was to purposely crash their aircraft into these ships.
Unable to sink numerically superior aircraft carriers through traditional methods, they instead must resort to the doctrine of kamikaze.
If this had been the United States and the Japanese were advancing on our homeland, and we had disadvantages in terms of resources, aircraft, and pilots, and wanted to fend off an advancing enemy, certainly, anything becomes possible.
Under the leadership of Admiral Onishi, thousands of men train for what will be their last mission. A true believer in the Bushido Code, Onishi, with the Emperor's blessing, begins organizing a suicidal war plan. The Oka, a piloted rocket bomb, is authorized along with a human torpedo known as the Kai-10, as weapons to be used against American ships.
There were a small number of special purpose kamikaze aircraft built, the most famous of which was the so-called Cherry Blossom, which was basically a bomb with stubby wings and a cockpit welded on top and a solid rocket motor. And this was dropped from a bomber. The solid rocket motor would be used to accelerate this into a dive approaching 600 miles per hour. So that was particularly difficult to counter when you had such a high terminal speed.
These are in addition to the thousands of kamikaze pilots being trained for their final act in uniform. The goal is simple: fly straight into American ships, and hopefully, with the mixture of fire and gasoline, the explosion causes the vessel to sink.
One pilot and one plane can take out a ship that may have 300 sailors, 500, maybe as many as 3,000 sailors with one well-placed hit. And in a number of occasions they did that or came close to doing it on many others.
And because the decks of American aircraft carriers are made of wood, the probability of a ship going down is even more likely. A key target then for the kamikaze pilots is the central deck elevator, believing that a successful attack can, at the very least, disable the carrier. The advantages of the kamikaze are numerous. Pilots need very little training. Obsolete aircraft can be used, and even if planes are hit by a proximity-fused shell, the momentum can hopefully keep the aircraft on target. The average kamikaze pilot is given a 1-week crash course in suicide attacks. 2 days are spent practicing takeoffs, another 2 to study formation flying, with the last 3 days spent on how to strike a target successfully.
It was a case where some very young pilots were kind of dragooned into doing this. Some older, experienced pilots who were gung-ho were ready to go and do it and maybe had to be restrained, but it went all along the spectrum, I think.
Crash diving, however, is not as simple as it may appear on paper. The powerful lift generated from the high winds makes it difficult to keep the nose of an aircraft on target. Also, there is the strong possibility of pilots blacking out from the heavy gravitational forces when they come crashing down. This entire strategy is a huge gamble, but for the Japanese, with their cities being destroyed, it is their only card left to play. By 1944, as the Americans are set to take back the Philippines in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first waves of kamikaze attacks are unleashed. Before taking off, Admiral Onishi tells his men as they drink sake, "You are already gods, without earthly desires. Your own crash dive is not in vain. Regrettably, we will not be able to tell you the results, but I shall watch your efforts in the end and report your deeds to the throne." On October 25th, a special attack unit led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki spots an American ship, the St. Lo. Diving straight down, his aircraft hits the ship's deck, exploding like a fireball. Going right through its wooden frame, subsequent explosions begin interacting with torpedoes and bombs on board the vessel, and a new chapter in Second World War history begins.
Then it struck. They call it kamikaze, meaning the divine tempest. We call them suicide planes, manned by pilots wearing the ceremonial red sash of the kamikaze corps. They specialize in one-way trips. Their destination, the deck or hull of any American ship onto which plane, bombs, burning gasoline, and red-sashed pilot flank.
Waves of kamikaze attacks are given the green light by Onishi, with targets not being limited to just strictly naval vessels. With the bombardment of Japanese cities by B-29 superfortresses, orders are given to attack these bombers with the same ferocity. The results prove disappointing. With the B-29's defensive armament that includes remote-controlled gun turrets, kamikaze planes are unable to stop these massive bombers from pulverizing the land of the rising sun.
The Japanese pilots would call them ice castles because they were so far up, and there was no need to camouflage the planes because you weren't. Their elevation was to keep them from having Japanese planes assault them. It was only when tactics changed, when there was a move to more low-level bombing, that the Japanese planes were able to attack them. Even then, there were many instances where the B-29s could actually outrun a Japanese fighter aircraft, was faster than the aircraft that was trying to pursue them.
And with a scorched earth strategy being carried out, the kamikaze fighter is in a race against the clock. Despite the destruction these tactics are having on American ships, the United States government does not retreat. Their final push to Tokyo will not be derailed, no matter what the cost. So for the next 10 months, American servicemen accept the possibility that today could be their very last.
For the kamikazes, psychologically, I don't think they were prepared at all. It just was such a foreign concept to these young guys, on a ship or in the air, to see somebody who would purposely sacrifice themselves as a way of trying to win a battle. It just was unimaginable to them.
I think that probably the greatest effectiveness of the kamikazes was that it was so incomprehensible to the American military leadership, American society, American understanding. And it did, don't get me wrong, there was a very real material effect of the kamikaze attacks, but I think the psychological effect really was quite powerful. That it was so hard for American soldiers and sailors and airmen to get their minds around this mentality of people who were willing to do this. And of course, it was very hard to answer. Normally, a lot of what air defense and self-defense in general is based on is the idea that this guy is trying to save his life, is trying to avoid being hit, doing something crazy. So it was very hard to answer this.
Hopefully, with the hundreds of guns, rockets, and shells on board destroyers, cruisers, frigates, and battleships, these sailors can shoot down the kamikaze before it is too late. In dealing with this menace, a strategy known as the Big Blue Blanket is employed by naval aviator John Thatch. The plan calls for around-the-clock surveillance by fighter planes over the American fleet, increased attacks on Japanese airfields, and stationing destroyer escorts 50 miles away from the main body to alert the other ships of any approaching Japanese aircraft.
Developing this whole system of radar picket ships that would spot the incoming kamikaze forces, keeping air patrols deployed really around the clock during some of the operations to try to intercept them. So still some did get through. Even in the Battle of Okinawa, it was mainly small ships, American ships, that were sunk. There were no large carriers or battleships that were actually, really put out of action and were sunk by the kamikaze attacks.
This strategy proved successful in disrupting the kamikaze. With Japan in a weakened state, skilled pilots become scarce. As a result, gunmen are finding it easier to shoot down oncoming planes being manned by inexperienced pilots. Despite the toll suicide attacks are taking on soldiers' psyches and lives, most notably on the USS Bunker Hill and the USS Franklin, where hundreds of servicemen are killed, the kamikaze is facing an equally fierce counterstrike.
Ultimately, it was the American military forces were so overwhelmingly powerful, this wasn't going to stop them. It could cause a lot of casualties, it could inflict a lot of pain along the way, but it wasn't sufficient at any point to even derail American strategic decisions. It caused tactical redeployments, it caused an American diversion of forces to try to deal with the kamikazes, but it couldn't alter American strategy.
The attacks reached their zenith during the battle for Okinawa, where hundreds of suicide planes are used in this pivotal conflict.
They did cause a lot of casualties. The climax was probably the Battle of Okinawa, where close to 2,000 kamikaze attacks took place.
A joint order is written by both the Japanese Army and Navy, establishing suicide as an official policy. This results in 30 American ships sunk and 300 badly damaged in the fight for Okinawa. In the end, the United States takes the island, but only after 12,000 American and 110,000 Japanese deaths. The effect of the kamikaze is being felt in Washington, D.C., where military and civilian planners decide what to do with Japan. Even with the unprecedented bombardment of their cities by B-29s, with the death toll being in the hundreds of thousands, the demand for an unconditional surrender is still not being met. Kamikaze missions, in addition to the fierce resistance offered on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, make generals like George Marshall favor the use of an atomic bomb. The Japanese had demonstrated in each case they would not surrender, said the general. We had to end the war. We had to save American lives. Since President Harry Truman takes office following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, American casualties reached nearly half the total of 3 years of battling against the Japanese in just 3 months.
It was something to contemplate. I remember the terrible anxiety through which the people in Washington went, and I was one of them, wondering what would happen when we attempted to take the main island of Japan.
Conventional wisdom leads the commander-in-chief to believe that the casualties resulting from a mainland invasion of Japan could be enormous, possibly in excess of 1 million men. For that reason, the decision to drop the first atomic bomb in history is approved by the president. On August 6th, the first nuclear weapon in history is used on the city of Hiroshima, and days later, a second bomb is dropped on the city of Nagasaki. After unprecedented carnage, the demand for an unconditional surrender is finally met. With the defeat of the Japanese comes the defeat of the kamikaze. The impact of these suicide attacks is still hotly debated.
At the time, in 1945, it was seen as a barbarian approach to warfare, an unheard of approach to warfare. 60 years later, you can start to equivocate and say, well, listen, they had to do this. It was in their interest and it was an honorable tactic.
The ships that were sunk as a result of kamikaze planes vary from the mid-30s to the high 50s. Approximately over 4,000 sailors were killed and another 4,000 wounded. However, the entire goal of the kamikaze backfires, causing war planners who may have still been on the fence in terms of whether to drop the atomic bomb or not, to support a nuclear attack on Japan. It was a strategy that grossly underestimated America's resolve in seeking an unconditional surrender from the land of the rising sun. For that reason, no number of suicidal pilots could have stopped the United States' war machine from achieving total victory.
The minuscule island, spanning less than a single square mile, claimed over 4,000 lives. Tarawa epitomizes the intense combat witnessed during the war, with American forces relentlessly pushing the Japanese back, one island at a time, across the Pacific. In February 1942, Japanese bombers launched an attack on the Australian mainland. This assault temporarily incapacitated the naval base in Darwin. As the Japanese advanced across New Guinea, some Australians feared it was the precursor to an invasion. However, discord between the Japanese Army and Navy halted their invasion plans, leaving them in abeyance. In reality, the Japanese found themselves stretched too thin. Amid the harsh conditions of the New Guinea jungle, Australian forces, bolstered by increasing American support, repelled the Japanese incursion toward the crucial base of Port Moresby. Along the Kokoda Trail, the Allies launched a counter-offensive. Disease and illness proved as formidable as enemy bullets. By the close of 1942, the threat to Australia had been neutralized, setting the stage for the protracted and bitter struggle to push the Japanese forces back to their homeland. The Allied offensive was divided between two rivals, General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific. The American strategy aimed at launching a dual assault against an enemy whose control spanned vast expanses of land and ocean. MacArthur's objective was to advance northward from the Solomons and New Guinea towards the Philippines. Meanwhile, Nimitz's forces were tasked with a series of strategic island-hopping maneuvers, beginning with the Gilberts in November 1943 at Tarawa, then progressing to the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and finally Okinawa. The initial target of Admiral Nimitz's island-hopping campaign was Tarawa Atoll, which had been fortified by the Japanese into a stronghold from which they could launch air attacks on US fleets. Taking Tarawa was imperative. It marked the first amphibious assault on a heavily fortified atoll shielded by a coral reef. Initially, none of the 5,000 Marines in the assault force comprehended the full extent of Tarawa's defenses.
They thought they would level the island and completely demolish everything, that there wouldn't be a living soul on the island.
I remember him telling us, this is going to be the easiest invasion we ever had. He says, we only need 2 men, one with a rifle and one with a slate, one to shoot him, one to chalk him up. It's going to be real easy.
I turned to the major who was standing next to me on the deck and said, some of our people aren't aiming very well today. And he said, you don't think those are our shells, do you? I realized then for the first time they were being shot at, and there were indeed some Japanese on Tarawa.
Everyone was confident that you could kick hell out of the Japanese. The Marines would have no problem with them if we could get our feet on the beach.
You must remember that the island was only 800 or 900 yards wide, and when you put 20,000 men on an island like that, it's quite crowded.
We were told that perhaps that we could take this island within a very short time, and it was quite evident within hours of our landing that this would not be so.
The foxholes that had been covered up with the naval gunfire, the next morning, within about 20 yards of where I was, I watched the Japanese digging out. They were digging the sand out of the place so that they could see out.
The battle persisted for 3 grueling days, gradually pushing the Japanese defenders back to one end of the diminutive island. The Japanese commander had arrogantly proclaimed that Tarawa could not be captured for a century.
If you can imagine the effect, nearly 6,000 dead men on an island this small, and considering that it's 1 degree from the equator, the amount of heat you have there, you can imagine the smell that you get within a day or two from all this rotting flesh. It was a sort of a sweet smell, sickly sweet, described it. And I don't know anywhere in World War II where there was such a concentration of death.
The outcome was stark. Out of 3,000 Japanese defenders, only 17 surrendered. The Americans suffered heavy losses, with over 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded. Public opinion in the United States was deeply shaken by the significant casualties incurred in such a brief span of combat. Following the Tarawa campaign, American invasion forces set their sights on the Mariana Islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Positioned west of Saipan, the Naval Task Force safeguarded the landings. In June 1944, Japan's mobile fleet from Okinawa approached, seeking a naval victory to shift the tide of the war in their favor. Suddenly, the Americans realized they'd been detected by the Japanese via radar. Every available American fighter was scrambled into the air to intercept successive waves of Japanese carrier-based planes. Many Japanese pilots were competitive novices with no battle experience. Their aircraft were poorly armoured. For the American pilots, engaging their adversaries felt as effortless as shooting turkeys. Following the initial skirmish, all but one of the American planes returned unscathed. Rearmed and refueled, the Americans stood prepared for the next Japanese offensive. Despite 2 subsequent onslaughts, the Americans held a significant advantage with nearly 900 carrier-based planes, double the size of the Japanese fleet. The Marianas aerial engagement lasted a mere 8 hours, resulting in the near decimation of Japanese naval airpower in a single day. The initial fleet of 430 planes was reduced to approximately 100. American losses remained comparatively minimal. This episode underscored the paramount importance of skilled pilots over sheer technological prowess. As dusk settled, the Americans emerged victorious in the aerial conflict, yet the whereabouts of the retreating Japanese fleet remained unknown. The following day, the American search for the enemy persisted. It wasn't until late afternoon that their aircraft finally spotted the mobile fleet, positioned over 200 miles away at the outer reaches of the American bomber's range. Despite the fading light, the order to attack was issued. In the ensuing engagement, the primary target of the American assault, the Japanese carrier force, suffered significant damage. One carrier was sunk and 2 others were left battered. This pivotal naval encounter, marked by a notable absence of direct fleet-to-fleet combat, concluded with the Japanese fleet reduced to a mere 35 aircraft as they retreated to their bases in Japan. But now, the American planes faced the challenge of returning to the carrier. The decision to engage in combat meant risking the possibility of running out of fuel during the journey home. The first to return were the fighters, which had provided protection for the task force. Landing in the dusk posed significant challenges, but the difficulty escalated as torpedo planes and bombers navigated to find their carriers in pitch darkness, with some never making it back.
Then it turned into probably the blackest night that I have ever seen in my life. And over the ocean, I guess we were at about 7,000 feet flying home. It's kind of our best altitude for fuel, and it was black as the ace of spades. And we could hear nothing, just ourselves, except the cries, or I won't say cry, but a very perfunctory call, I'm going to have to land in the water, I'm out of fuel. And this continued just constantly until all the torpedo planes that had survived the strike went into the water. And then I suppose about 100 miles from the force, the dive bombers started to run out of fuel, and they called out, this is whatever the call was, I don't really remember the number, I'm going in, out of fuel. And then it became quite quiet until we got within range of the force, and then you could start to make out what was happening at the task force and what the recovery course would be. We'd not yet seen it because the ships were running blacked out, which is a normal operating procedure, so it couldn't be detected from the air. But the Admiral knew that we were going to have an awful problem getting aboard, and they were low on fuel, and we didn't have time to really look for the force. A decision was made, and the command was given out to the carriers to turn their lights on.
The subsequent day saw the task force successfully rescuing the majority of aircrews who had been forced to ditch in the ocean. The triumph in the Battle of the Philippine Sea ensured that the Mariana landings could proceed without interference from the Japanese Navy. Saipan fell at a heavy cost of 3,000 American lives. Tinian, though less fortified, also succumbed. Guam, however, managed to hold out for 3 weeks. As the American forces advanced westward from the Marianas, Nimitz transferred an amphibious force under MacArthur's command, marking a convergence of the 2 rival prongs. Their joint objective became the Palau group of islands. These had been taken before the invasion of the Philippines. On one island, Peleliu, the Americans again run into nautical resistance from a crack force of 10,000 Japanese troops. Rather than confronting the Americans on the beaches, the Japanese had retreated into an intricate network of caves and tunnels. The Americans found themselves locked in a grueling struggle for every inch of ground against a resolute enemy prepared to fight to the last. The brutal battle for Peleliu exacted a heavy toll, with 4 out of every 10 American participants killed or wounded.
This was no campaign like Peleliu. Much has been written about it. in the higher echelons, among generals, and so forth, comparing it to Iwo Jima or Tarawa. And they all admit that there was nothing quite like Peleliu. It was the biggest surprise I think the Marine Corps received in World War II. We just had never known an enemy like this.
It took months before all of the Japanese defenders were routed out. Victory on these Pacific islands came at a steep price. On October the 20th, 1944, MacArthur fulfilled his pledge by returning to the Philippines. The landings encountered minimal resistance. The Japanese had retired inland to their main defences, but the invasion touched off the largest and most complex naval battle in history. The battle for Leyte Gulf stretched across 4 days, with 4 Japanese forces converging on the Philippines from Borneo, Formosa and mainland Japan. The Americans, commanding the 7th and 3rd Fleets, aimed to thwart the Japanese objective of annihilating the American invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. Following a series of disjointed engagements occurring hundreds of miles apart, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered substantial losses, rendering it ineffective as a fighting force. Meanwhile, relentless rainfall impeded the progress of MacArthur's troops, facing off against a Japanese army numbering nearly 400,000. By February 1945, just 3 months after the Leyte landings, American forces were encroaching upon the Philippine capital, Manila. It marked the first instance in the Pacific War where Americans engaged in urban warfare, with battles raging from street to street and house to house. Many civilians lost their lives, some executed by the retreating Japanese. MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines capital marked a pivotal moment. American prisoners, held captive during the Japanese invasion, were finally liberated after enduring 3 years of captivity. With the American recapture of the Philippines, vital supply routes crucial for Japanese industry would be severed. The Japanese leadership understood that losing control of the Philippines meant losing the war. Following liberation came a period of reckoning, as individuals sought revenge against Filipinos accused of collaboration during the years of Japanese occupation, bringing closure to a tumultuous chapter. In February 1945, the focus shifted to Iwo Jima, an 8-square-mile expanse of volcanic rock located just 600 miles from the Japanese coast, representing the next strategic leap across the Central Pacific. From Iwo Jima, American bombers gained strategic proximity, enabling raids on Japanese cities with unprecedented ease. Perched atop Mount Suribachi's commanding heights, the Japanese maintained a vigilant watch over every movement on Iwo Jima. Once again, the bulk of Japanese forces were positioned inland, away from the shoreline. Over a span of 76 days preceding the landing, the Americans subjected Iwo Jima to relentless bombardment from both sea and air.
The waste, the barrenness of the place, it was actually like a nightmare. It was the closest thing you could see to hell. If ever hell looked like anything, it must look like Iwo Jima.
The minute you got in those boats, you were scared, and you were scared until you hit the beach.
You realize that you're going in to kill, and we were always taught that we had to kill or be killed. It was either us or the Japanese, one or the other. And when you're faced with a situation, as a young man, I was only 19, it's confusing. You built in the Marine Corps to take orders and to obey orders, but at the same token, you're still a human being, and you're only 19 or 20. Most of us were only 18, 19, or 20 during those days. I think the public has the idea that Marine are Supermen, but I don't think there was a Marine in the amphibious landing craft that wasn't afraid, including the officers. I was always taught to hate them in the Marine Corps, to detest them, and that they were animals, that we were the men, they were the animals. By the same token, we were taught that they would die for the emperor, that we weren't taught to die for our president. And to fight or to come up against an individual who wants to die or who doesn't care about dying is a tough thing to combat in your mind. We wanted to live, we wanted to kill him, and we wanted to survive.
You have to keep your head down because there's too much fire above you. And it's that constant wondering, is somebody going to drop a lucky one in there and you're too far out to swim with all that gear on? And what are you going to get into when you get there? It's a hell of a place to be.
And as you hit the island and you saw the ash and nothing living, it was, if there's ever been hell, this was it. Well, we hit the beach itself. Actually, there was a little incline, and everybody clung to the incline because the fire was that heavy. And everything that hit the beach was blasted out of the water as fast as it hit.
I was young then. This is my fourth operation. I was 18. My first operation, I was 16.
They just lay there and waited for us, and rhythmically just kept on tattooing every man along the line. And you just couldn't avoid it. The slaughter was fantastic. We were just walked into a web, and there was no way out. You couldn't get off the beach.
And getting into the beach was a depressing scene. It sort of knocked your morale down when you start to see your own people from your own team dead. There was this, from the water's edge to sort of a rise, there was a tremendous amount of bodies just lying there.
We moved about, possibly 300 yards in, just as far as they meaning the Japanese, decided for us to go.
There was no way of getting off the island. Not that first night. It was just too congested. There was nothing that could move off that island the first night.
Entrenched on the slopes of Mount Suribachi, the Japanese command had concentrated their artillery. Despite the extensive preliminary bombardment, the Japanese strongholds remained resilient, requiring ground troops to systematically dismantle them one by one. Capturing Iwo Jima proved to be a far lengthier endeavour than the 5 days envisioned by the American command.
The entire vegetation was gone completely. And you awaken in the morning and you look out across this particular expanse of no man's land, and it was bubbling and seething with steam coming out of the ground. In fact, we had to use cardboard from sea ration packs to put down in the foxhole so that your ass wouldn't burn up. If there is a hell, I'm living through it now. So I don't have to worry about going to hell anytime in the future. I've been there. one of the guys came up to me as a man with a family. I never did even know him. Just, meeting him at that particular day. And I said, well, we're in a mortar outfit back here, fairly well safe, no problems. Before the day was over, he and half of my other squad was dead.
I think the worst part was you get callous, to dead bodies and bloated bodies, but you never get callous to your own friends in that way. And I think that perhaps was the most terrible thing of Iwo Jima.
I think if everybody remembered all of the tragic things that happened, you would go crazy. You wouldn't be able to survive it.
Oh, you always think you're going to make it. You're scared, but you still think you're going to make it.
It was just one of the biggest messes I myself had ever seen. I don't know who the beach master was, but he probably had the roughest job of any man I've ever heard of.
Although the situation may have appeared chaotic at times, the logistical prowess supporting the assault force underscored America's inevitable victory over Japan, rooted in its overwhelming industrial might since the onset of the Pearl Harbor attacks.
Only one thing seemed to permeate the men. Get that $1 million wound to get off this damn place.
Inland from the beaches, Iwo Jima descended into yet another grueling battle of attrition. With American forces advancing inch by inch against Japanese defenders who chose death over surrender with unwavering resolve. Their leaders still hoped the Americans might tire of their losses and of the war.
My Lord, Iwo, it was hand-to-hand fighting. You didn't know who was even in the hole with you half of the time.
She went into the caves. We lost most of our people in this particular fashion. You went into the caves and you fought it out with the guy. One of you came out.
I don't think anybody really realized that they were underground so deeply. And it was so heavily defended, really.
After 3 days of fierce combat on Mount Suribachi, the Stars and Stripes triumphantly flew atop the summit.
Boy started to holler, there goes the flag. And I don't care where you were on that island, you could see right up to Suribachi, and the flag was raised. And everybody started to howl because we figured, well, the island was secure, but it was far from secure. We had a long way to go yet, but it was nice to see the flag up there anyway.
They always told you to take prisoners, but we had some bad experiences on Saipan taking prisoners. You take them, and as soon as they get behind the lines, they drop grenades, and you lose a few more people. You're a little bit leery about taking prisoners when they're fighting to the death, and so are you.
Very few of them came out on their own. When they did, usually one in the front, he'd come out with his hands up, and one behind him, he'd come out with a grenade.
One of the West Virginia boys, but he was sitting against a stone wall with his knees up under his helmet, as we used to sit quite often, when one of the enemy ran out onto the top of the stone wall and held a small explosive charge to his abdomen, and a chunk of his torso, a lower torso, went spiraling into the air and came down on John's knees, with the absolute posterior, devoid of any clothes, staring him right in the face. And he looked at that and he says, "God, am I hit that bad?" And that was the trigger that released the tensions of the previous night. And there were several of us that were perfectly useless for as much as an hour. We were just laying on the ground in convulsions.
Out of the 21,000 Japanese troops present on Iwo Jima at the onset of the attack, a mere 200 were captured alive.
I was on the island a total of 6 days, and it seemed like 6,000 years.
Remarkably, Iwo Jima's airfields were operational even before the island fell, a testament to the crucial role played by the American construction battalions, known as the CBs, not only on this island but throughout the entire Pacific theatre of war. With the capture of Iwo Jima accomplished, attention turned to breaching Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Located 350 miles from the mainland, Okinawa stood as the last significant barrier between the Allies and the planned invasion of Imperial Japan. On April 1, 1945, the Americans launched their assault. In defense of Okinawa, Japan's young suicide pilots, the kamikaze, fiercely engaged the Allied forces. Many of these pilots embarked on their fatal missions using outdated aircraft, some even repurposed trainers.
So many things were happening and so quick that it was a little bit like a big boxer in a ring when he's being hit to the chin and to the side of the face and bodies and everywhere else, because we were catching it from so many different angles. In a regular attack, it's a sporting chance you've got, you know. I mean, with regular bombs and regular bullets, you think you've got a very good chance. But war is not so much of a sport when you're fighting human bombs.
Although over 2,000 kamikaze pilots met their demise, their attacks resulted in the destruction of 30 US warships and inflicted damage upon 200 more.
You were praying that you could survive whatever the kind of explosion would come about. Your whole life flashed in front of you very quickly because you didn't know whether it'd be seconds or minutes until your life would be snuffed out.
American casualties were so severe that at one point it seemed the invasion of Okinawa might be stopped in its tracks.
The gunners can't turn it off. Once they gear themselves up to fight man against man bomb, you know, even though the plane is down, and why it's hard for the gunner to stop. One man he was in a 40 millimeter mount, and he had been fighting against quite a number of planes that had come in, but we had been hit in his area also 2 or 3 times, and all of a sudden, with nobody understanding why, he just yelled out, "It's hot today," and jumped over the side, and that's the last we ever saw of him. But had he stayed aboard, he might have survived. But of course, we couldn't find his body or anything after that. But it was an unusual way for a type of reaction. He stayed with it just as long as he could until he broke. And then that was the end of his fighting. But every man, I believe, has a breaking point. And the kamikaze is, I would estimate, is probably tests that breaking point more than any other form of combat.
The initial landings on Okinawa proceeded unopposed, but as the Americans advanced inland, they encountered a formidable Japanese army of 100,000 troops, entrenched in a heavily fortified central position.
The steep hills and narrow ravines of Okinawa formed a natural citadel for the Japanese defenders.
The rugged terrain of steep hills and narrow ravines on Okinawa provided a natural stronghold for the Japanese defenders. However, as Japan itself neared surrender, not every Japanese soldier remained committed to fighting until the bitter end. Meanwhile, the civilians of Okinawa endured devastating losses, with 24,000 killed and many thousands more injured.
Once they found out that we weren't going to do the things that they had always heard, well, they could understand, hey, this is just another human being, and possibly they felt the same as we did, that we weren't there because we wanted to be there. It was we were told that this is what we had to do.
For many Americans, concluding their monumental campaign across the Pacific, it became evident that the perceived faceless fanatics willing to sacrifice themselves for their emperor were, in fact, fellow human beings.
They showed kindness to their own people too, which we didn't really think, that we thought, well, one was just, life was cheap to them, but that's not true. They were, showed a lot of kindness to their own wounded, and would tote them on their back, and 2 or 3 would carry them, although they were weak themselves, so they were people just like us.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
The only reason for an airplane to exist is to go fast. At the Great Air Meet in Rheims, Glenn Curtis set a world's record of just over 43 miles an hour, and the quest for speed was on. In 1913, Maurice Prévost was flying a streamlined Dépôt-Dessin monoplane at 126 miles an hour, and Europe claimed the lead in aviation speed. Immediately after World War I, quest for speed became a catalyst for the development of fighter planes. Countries which had not invested in new engines for their wartime fighters would, for reasons of national pride, invest in new engines to race them eastward. Then, in America in the 1930s, the situation reversed itself. Civilian aircraft, like the Travel Air Mystery Ship and the GB, Waddell Williams racers, became even faster than military aircraft. The reason was simple. Same engines were available to both civil racers and military fighters. The fighters had to carry guns, bombs, oxygen, and radios, while the racers were built only for speed. The world's absolute speed record was passed from country to country. And as the racers became faster and more powerful, they also became more expensive. America's Howard Hughes could afford to build his own racer, and with it set a land-plane speed record. But the absolute speed record of 440 miles an hour was set by a Macchi MC-72 seaplane in 1934, financed by the Italian government. Then military aircraft came back into the lead as the Heinkel and Messerschmitt firms competed for the title. Messerschmitt Bf-109R set a speed record of 469 miles an hour in 1939, a record that lasted for many years. When the jet aircraft came out, speed records rapidly accelerated, the British breaking 1,000 miles an hour in 1956 in a Fairey Delta II. Speeds continued to climb, finally reaching 2,193 miles an hour in 1976 by the Lockheed SR-71, alias Blackbird. While speed was the object, there were many other benefits in creating ever faster aircraft. Improvement in fuels, streamlining, lubricants, materials, and the list goes on. Speed produced not only prestige and pleasure, but also utility. The speed record setters ultimately paved the way for commercial transports, business jets, and private planes.